Nelly Spieler.
Correct.
Even the Russians say Spieler?
Spieler.
Wow. In German, that's someone who plays, right? A sports person, or
That's correct.
is it the same in Russian?
No, not the same, but the pronunciation is very much the same, just a little bit rolling R at the end.
Okay. I'm South African, and Afrikaners like to roll their R's, so we're good, very comfortable with that.
That's good.
So Nelly's in the CTO studio with me today. Super jazzed to have her. She is a partner at Frank Rimmerman.
Rimmerman, that's correct. It's actually two last names, Frank and Rimmerman, as
Frank. Oh, okay. Frank and Rimmerman. You've been there for about 8 years, right?
Correct.
And you're focused, and the reason we're talking is very much focused on compliance and audits and assertions and all that kind of stuff, right? So,
right. My group, two primary service lines are SOC audits and ISO 27001 certification audits.
perfect. And the reason you're with the CTOs today, which I'm imagining maybe you're with them a lot, or your team is how critically important it is for us to focus and help our companies, not be open to threats of being out of compliance, legal threats, privacy threats, data breach threats. And so what I've noticed in the last, I don't know how long SOC 2 has been around for, but it's been sort of a general rule or general agreed upon trust mechanism to share reports on how we all handle the various criteria, correct?
That's right. It's SOC 2 has been around for a number of years. There was a predecessor to SOC 2. There was something called SAS 70, and that has been around for a number of years, since I want to say early 70s of last century, and it morphed into different standards. Eventually, it broke into two main frameworks called SOC 1 and SOC 2. SAS 70 sort of directly moved into the SOC 1, which is the controls around financial reporting, called ICFRs, internal controls over financial reporting, and SOC 2 is more about security, availability, and commitments that your company makes to its customers around security, availability, and let's say data confidentiality. And it is now more or less a de facto compliance standard because it is industry agnostic. It doesn't matter what industry you are in. It is SOC could be applied to your platform, to the services that you provide.
In other words, more and more it's becoming best practice or business practice to ask for each other's, of course, under NDA or something, to ask for each other, whether you're a vendor or a large B2B customer, to ask for those reports, right?
Very much so. SOC 2, there are multiple whys you want to go and have why you want to undergo SOC 2 audit. It establishes a framework for your company to manage company's risks. It assists your company with legal and contractual and sometimes regulatory requirements. It helps you to get a competitive marketing edge over your competition. If your competition doesn't have SOC 2 and you do, it is a marketing edge. It demonstrates good security practices and sound culture of compliance. It builds credibility and promotes trust between your company and your customers. It also provides independent assurance of how effective your controls are by a third-party audit coming and conducting the audit. And overall, it helps companies improve organizational and control structure and focus.
So it's not the the output of a SOC 2 effort is a report that gets audited.
The output of a SOC 2 is a report, but a SOC 2 is you go through an audit, and as a result of the audit, you get a report. And the report is anything between maybe like 50 and 100 pages. It describes your controls, it describes your platform or your service, and sort of provides context to your control. And also has a few sort of a more legalese sections where it is your management assertion and our opinion as auditors of what we do. You have those controls in place? Are your controls operating effectively?
Okay, so there's some opinion of the auditor in there?
Yes, there is an opinion, and it depends on the type of audit you are undergoing. It has different sections of the opinion, but yes, there is an auditors issue their opinion.
So we're talking about SOC 2, Type 1, Type 2, and I was asking about whether you can actually fail an audit.
So it's unlikely that you will fail Type 1 because it is an audit of controls as of specific date. And when auditors come, they look at your controls, and if you are not ready, if there are some gaps, your controls are not operating as sort of as you want them, and it just means that you could push it to the next whatever, to June 30th, for example, from May 31st, and fix the gaps. Obviously, it's a waste of resources because in time, but it is possible to do. In Type 2, which is an audit over a period of time, where auditors are looking at how controls operate. Are they operate actually effectively? Are they operating as designed? There you could have, well, let's just say 3 opinions that auditor could issue. One is what's called unqualified opinion, meaning that we didn't find any issues. Second possibility is called qualified opinion, where we would say everything is great except for a specific area. And that happens. It doesn't happen very often, but let's say if the category of controls around change management, wherever we look, every control we look has issues, then we would say we're okay with everything except change management area. So we will qualify our opinion. And then the third one is adverse opinion. And that is sort of we cannot issue our opinion. That happens very rarely. I don't know actually anybody who had that done. I've never issued an adverse opinion. I did probably issue maybe 2 or 3 qualified opinions. But then again, the time frame that we are auditing is a defined and agreed upon time frame. And let's say it is an adverse opinion that you received. You just say, okay, let's just have another audit. And let's fix everything and shift the time frame, and then we will have another audit after we fix the issues. And that's sorry.
But in the end, the customer asking for the SOC 2 report, or for whatever reason, whoever's asking for it, they might just be interested in specific sections of the report, right? Or is there a general red, yellow, green light on the report?
It depends on what industry the customers are. Sometimes they just look at the SOC report as a binary. You either have it or you don't. Sometimes they read with a fine-tooth comb, and I had some clients that say, yeah, they looked and they said, well, why it's not TLS 1.2 encryption that it is? They look at that level of detail. And it's more sort of dependent on who is looking and how sophisticated your prospects or your customers' procurement department is or security team, how knowledgeable they are around SOC audits.
Yeah, it makes total sense to me that in this day and age of data and privacy and security, that there should be some agreed upon contract between vendors, third parties, customers on how things are managed. Everything from developers and the code base and access to code, passwords, to the building, to, I think I heard whether there are screen locks on screens.
So the SOC 2 framework has 5 categories of controls, and they are security, availability, confidentiality, processing integrity, and privacy. When a company undergoes an audit and chooses to have a SOC 2 audit, they must have category called security. It's also referred to as common criteria. The other 4 categories are optional and could be added on if initially you just only go through security. But they could be added on or initially have them on in any combination. You could have security and privacy, security, availability, confidentiality. You could have all 5. Obviously, the more categories you have, the longer and the more difficult audit is. Most common I see is security, availability, confidentiality. These are 3 that are very frequently asked, but it's all driven by what your customers are asking for. If they are not asking for something specific, then maybe just security is a good path to go. But each of these categories has a set of requirements. The requirements are the same for any company that undergoes SOC audit. It could be a large company like Google or Amazon, Salesforce. They undergo SOC audits, SOC 2 audits, and the requirements are the same as a startup of 10 people or 50 people. Controls that are addressing those requirements will probably be different. So the requirement is rather generic, and it is generic for a purpose because it must fit different size of the companies and companies in different industries. So SaaS companies or cloud may be different than manufacturing companies, or I had one that was auto repair shop, or not shop, company, and they have shops and they sort of they have a platform there. But that's sort of, there could be different industries as long as you're providing a service. I have a company that does short-term disability processing. So the requirements are rather generic and the same for everybody, and the controls that companies have are unique to them. One control can meet more than one requirement, and usually one requirement is addressed by more than one control. It's not a one-to-one relationship. If there are 20, if there are 40 requirements, it doesn't mean that you have 40 controls.
Yes, I understand. Makes sense. So does your team have the expertise then to audit what the company is saying? Is that literally on your team you need experts to understand the jargon and all that?
Yeah, that's what my team does. We the process typically for any audit is a type 1, which is as point of time, or type 2 is we will have a list of requests, audit requests, sometimes called document request list, to see are your controls actually in place and are your controls operating as they're designed. We also have something called walkthroughs, which is a sort of a auditor term for interviews. We will interview different process owners about the processes and controls to try to figure out sort of what tools are being used. There are different sort of deviations from the process. There may be standard process, like this is a typical way we promote code to production. This is the typical way to release code. Or it could be emergency fixes or hot fixes. Or you have, here is what you do with domestic employees, and here are how you handle international employees. So what are controls? What are those sort of gates that you have to make sure that the risks that those processes have are addressed? So we're looking at that, and we're interviewing. And then we examine evidence. Auditors need to write work papers where for each control there will be a work paper written up, and we come with a conclusion whether there are deviations from the control or there are no deviations. Often there are deviations, and that's okay. Let's say if you are saying that you do background checks on your employees, and we sample, 10 employees, 10 new hires, and we found that one background check either didn't happen or you didn't do it in a timely fashion, that would be a deviation from the control. That does not mean that the audit will be qualified, that you will get a qualified report. It just means that, yes, there is a deviation, and a lot of companies have that. And you'll have an opportunity to explain why it happened and what is it that you are doing to fix it. So that you'll have your corrective action plan.
So there's not you aren't SOC 2 compliant. You have a audited SOC 2 report.
We issue reports, yes.
Okay.
We do the audit and we issue a report.
So is it possible for one SOC 2 report to have two different opinions from two different audit firms? You said you issue a report based on controls, correct?
Mm-hmm.
And controls fulfill requirements according to the 5 criteria.
Correct.
Okay.
Yes. If you hire 2 auditors, you will have 2 different reports. It's unlikely that one will have a qualified opinion and another has unqualified opinion.
So has the SOC 2 process actually become a really cool way for CTOs or even a whole business to understand whether they are adhering to top requirements? Is it actually an informative thing to do, or is it a pain in the ass thing to do that feels superfluous and why the hell are we doing this?
It could be both. I don't think a lot of companies like compliance, but it also depends on your auditors. It could depend on who you are partnering with. There are tools, for example, that you could use and more or less will prepare you, and very often you don't really talk too much to your auditors. It's sort of they come in and audit very quickly, and out of your hair, you don't know what happened. You do need to provide the requests and evidence. There are auditors that will partner with you and provide you feedback and try to add value. They will look at your processes and say, yeah, you are still a startup, and here is probably the baseline of your controls, but let's see how you're maturing. And they, like, for example, we have always closing meetings where we will talk through and say, okay, this is not really a requirement, but you may want to show that you are doing that because your customers are asking for it. What I noticed, one of the misconceptions is that sometimes companies that work with the more like tools believe that there is a set requirements or that there are required controls. There are no required controls. There are requirements. You have
Yes,
your controls. You can
that's very
design
interesting.
your controls. For example, your auditors or in the tools, you could be asked, you have to have a code of conduct. Why do you need to have a code of conduct? Because agreed, you may want to have a code of conduct, but why is it in the SOC 2? There is a requirement that talks about ethical values and integrity, that company demonstrates ethical values and integrity. That's more or less what the requirement states. The fact that you provide code of conduct as evidence, it's just one way of addressing that requirement. If you have some other way of showing that you tone from the top, that your company adheres to has ethical values, or it's just, it could be different way, and it doesn't have to be
Absolutely.
called even code of conduct. Maybe it's some cultural guidelines or something else. So
But so sorry, go ahead.
your auditors should know framework and those requirements well enough in order to be able to kind of be flexible and figure out how they could tease out when they tease out those words, or sort of what else you do, how else you're addressing risk. So it doesn't have to be that defined set of controls.
Got it. Got it. Now that's a very interesting revelation, that it's not dictating controls. It is just adhering. What controls do you have in place to adhere to requirements? I love that.
Correct. Yes.
So when an auditor is taking a look at the controls, so I'm assuming the requirements come in, or the requirements are out there. Someone like the CTO is like, okay, we do A, we do B, we do C. They submit the documents. When you audit those documents and you are not, what was the three categories? You are either
Qualified or adverse.
Yeah. So let's say you're unqualified. Your conclusion is that it's unqualified. Do you just tell them, okay, our opinion is that it's unqualified. Work on this and send us something. Is it a collaborative process, or is it a bit of a punitive process?
It's, again, it depends. Like I could talk about how I work. So we will collect the evidence and we review and examine evidence, and it is a lot of back and forth. We usually have weekly status calls with our customers to go through and talk through anything that is not clear. For example, if you have a control that says that you disable access to production and customer data within 24 hours of somebody's being terminated, and we look at, and you give us a list of everybody who has access to production and customer data, and you give us a list of terminated people. We look at the list of who has access to production and who was terminated, and we could find maybe somebody who is on the termination list and also has access to production. Then my first question is like, why? I don't immediately jump to the conclusion, oops, that shouldn't be the case. Because there are situations where you maybe converted somebody from an employee to a contractor, and this person is totally okay to have access. They continue legitimately have authorized access to production. That doesn't mean that it is an exception. It just needs to be clarified and confirmed. But there are sometimes exceptions to those controls. There are deviations from controls, and we would confirm. We'll always ask, are you okay? And that's okay. Again, it doesn't necessarily lead to a bad opinion or qualifying opinion. It's just a deviation. You just don't want to have too many of those things in one particular area.
Got it. So you're eventually going to formulate an opinion that
like on the whole audit. It's not just on a specific area, but it's a very collaborative, from my perspective, it's a very collaborative process. And the higher, let's say, quality of the evidence, the fewer questions we'll have. Because sometimes we receive evidence and it's kind of somebody makes a print screen and says, yeah, it shows approval, but then the print screen cuts off the approval. So it's like, well, we cannot really say that it was done because it's not clear where we could confirm it. Because auditors are, we're looking at the evidence to verify that what you are saying is actually true.
Mm.
And the more objective the evidence, the better. And the cleaner or higher quality evidence, the fewer questions we will have, and consequently, less time it's on you and your staff to answer those questions.
Got it. So what I'm trying to ascertain is going through the SOC 2 process helpful to up your game?
It is so from different perspective. It helps your staff to answer and to save time by not answering all those security questionnaires. It also, when you talk to prospects, it sort of changes the tone when you are discussing something with the security team of your prospect. If you say that, yes, we have a SOC 2 report, we've been audited, and especially if you've been doing it for a number of years, if you have recurring those audits, it internally, it does help to mature for the organization. It also provides feedback to more executive staff on what's happening, because audits are we're looking at quite operational controls. And the C-suite may think that this is what's happening. Just okay. And then when we go in and start looking, sometimes it's not what's happening. It may be something different. So we do believe that by having that audit, we provide some insights or some feedback to the executive team about what is actually happening operationally.
So I do want to get into some of the requirements for each of those criteria. So can we get into that a little bit at some point? Before I get to that, if I am a CTO and I want to start the SOC 2 process, is it a self-service where I download, look at the requirements, implement the controls, and then bring someone like you in? Or do I first contact an audit firm or an attorney or whatever, and then start the process?
The requirements are public. You can download it from AICPA site. If you Google it, you will find the link, and it's a downloadable Excel file. It's, as I said, it's a public information. The requirements have something called points of focus, which are more like illustrative discussions of each of the requirements. They are not all of those points of focus have to be implemented. It's just the illustration of the requirement. So once you have that, you could decide, do you want to develop your program and your controls and build that SOC program internally? You have enough personnel, or you have personnel who knows how to do it. You could hire consultants. You could find a tool that helps you build that. But you don't need, you could just do it on your own. You don't need to have a consultant, and you don't need to have a tool. If you find the right audit partner, they should be able to help you with explaining the criteria requirements and walking you through the process and be your sounding board.
Yeah.
They cannot design your controls. They cannot write your policies because of the independence, but they could say, okay, well, here is what I've seen. Here are 4 options that I've seen, or 5 options that I've seen of how this control or how this requirement has been addressed. Or something like you need a template. Sure, here is a template, and it may be a very comprehensive template. You read it and you adjust it to your company, to how you operate. But you could also decide that you could hire a consultant to prepare you and to project manage you through the audit.
Probably. I can see how, especially if it's requirements that you feel like you don't necessarily know how to adhere to that, then I'm sure a partner can help you with what controls, like you said, what they've seen other people do, and all that.
Yep. And I've worked with companies that just have, let's say, the Atlassian shop. They have Jira ticketing system, and they're designing everything on their own. It does take time for the internal folks to focus on that. So you just sort of need to consider the capacity of your personnel, not only the knowledge. But knowledge, in all honesty, SOC is not rocket science. Once you sort of understand it and know how it's all done and what auditors are looking for, you could just sort of you just need time to work with the auditors. That's all you need.
Yeah, and that I find is the greatest adversarial force in a company, is that everyone feels too busy, it takes too much effort, and it feels too superfluous.
Well, it depends. Well, I agree that everybody is really busy, and that's sort of the decision. How do you find that time? If you have many frameworks that you need to be compliant to, then probably you need to have somebody dedicated to this effort.
Yes, and that's where.
Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, that's where companies will bring in their director of compliance or CPO.
And then sometimes it falls on the laps of security people that they need to kind of, or DevOps people, if we are talking about cloud. And when it's SOC, once you kind of have that program and first year of audit done, it's less burdensome. It's much more, yes, it will still take time, but not as much as when you're initially setting it up. So then you kind of decide, okay, do I need to have a consultant to run that through that program once the auditors come to help us just more or less project manage it. Tools, there's been a lot of new GRC, it's called GRC tools or compliance tools. GRC stands for governance, risk, and compliance. Lots of compliance tools popping up left and right that help companies sort of establish the controls, document controls. They are not always cheap. So if the company is resource constrained financially, then and want to do the more of a sweat equity, then it may make sense to do it internally. But there are tools. The value I see for those tools now, at least, is if those tools allow you to configure automate evidence collection. Because there is I find it zero value in collecting and doing print screens, and I don't think any company likes that when the auditor says, well, I need to show me where it is that you're encrypting data, and you need to do a print screen and give it to the auditors, and then 200 print screens later, you are sort of, I'm so done with that. That's what probably a lot of companies feel, that kind of being busybody without much of the value. So there are, if you internally could automate sort of write some scripts and collect the evidence automatically and sort of dump it into some wherever in the network drive or in the G drive or whatever it is, right? Then it's much easier to go through the audit than just doing print screens. But there are tools that where you could write the queries, and they have suggested queries, and they say, okay, show me everything in your AWS account that doesn't have multi-factor, all the user accounts that don't have multi-factor authentication. So it automatically pulls everything and kind of keeps it all together. So the automation is probably one thing that I would encourage companies that want to make it more efficient to look at that.
Got it. Great. So let's maybe just as a distinction, can you talk about the ISO 27000 what 27001?
So there is a standard called ISO 27001, and that is international standard around security. There are supporting documents that explain that standard and different parts of it. There is some that are specifically about risk assessment. There are some that are explaining all the controls in the standard. And they're also having the numbers like 27,002, 27,005. But the main standard is 27,001. The companies that typically we see want to have an ISO certification are targeting international customers.
Okay.
SOC is still very much a US-centric framework, whereas ISO is much more international. If I go and I talk to somebody in Germany, they will most likely ask for ISO, and not everyone there heard of SOC. So ISO and SOC requirements are, when you sort of start reading the details, they're like a Venn diagram. There is a big overlap. ISO is, at the end of ISO, you get a certificate. You do not get a 100-page report. So when you get a certificate, it will say the auditors certified that you have ISMS, which is Information System Management System, and the certificate is issued on whatever date, and it expires 3 years from that issue date. ISO is a 3-year certification. You don't have a qualified or unqualified opinions in ISO. In ISO, you just get a cert. If you have really sort of failed your ISO, you just don't get a cert. You just don't get that certification. The way ISO works is there is an audit, and then as a result of the audit, during the audit, you learn all the issues that the audit uncovers. And major issues, they're called non-conformities. Major non-conformities need to be fixed within a defined time frame, like 6 months, before you could get a certificate. So in the SOC, you kind of look back and you say, okay, here are all the issues. Auditors say, we found all this, and it gets noted in the report. In the ISO, you have to fix everything, and then you get, not everything, major non-conformities, and then you get the certification. It won't say how many non-conformities you had, what they were. You fixed them already. It's a much more of the sort of a process improvement focused certification or audit. The length of the audit is different. The think about ISO is more of here we have this the company puts together a program of how they're managing security, and the ISO auditor comes in and looks at that program. The audit itself, the length of the audit, maybe maybe a week, maybe 2 weeks. SOC audit could be much longer. It's sort of a lot of back and forth. Give me the evidence for this control. Here is sort of when you go back and forth until you test all controls. In the ISO audit, during, let's say, 1 week, it's more of a show and tell.
Got it.
Show me how you do it. Oh, you don't do it? Okay, maybe non-conformity, move on, let's go to the next one. And then you just have to fix those non-conformities before you get the certification.
So that makes a lot of sense. You can either obtain or fail to obtain the ISO 27001 certification.
Right.
Is there, I guess, if you're a multinational company or if you are a global organization with international customers, they will say, are you an ISO 27001
certified?
Okay.
Yep. But it doesn't, it depends. It doesn't have to be a large company. If you are selling internationally, you could be asked by your prospects abroad for an ISO, and then you have to explain, well, I don't have an ISO, but I have a SOC. You just need to explain what SOC is. And
exactly.
So it depends. And I have clients that have both. They have, and there are startups, for example, of, 100 people, 50 people, and they have both SOC and ISO.
Okay, so thank you for that distinction. So just as we sort of maybe go into the second part of this conversation, let's dig in a little bit into each of the trust criteria for SOC 2. My goal is to pull the curtain back a little bit for someone who hasn't even gone to the AICPA website and doesn't even know what they don't know.
Yep.
And so in as much as you think the highlighting the important requirements that maybe each trust criteria has, would that be productive? Are you good with that?
Yeah, definitely.
So let's start. Well, why don't we start with the first one, which is security? What are the requirements generally for what controls? What requirements would drive people to create controls?
Yep. So the security is the let's say bare minimum for a SOC 2 audit. You have to have security, address security requirements, and these are also called common criteria. It's called common criteria because security is common to availability, to also requirements to confidentiality. You cannot have privacy without security. So it's sort of having that baseline. This criteria is built on something called COSO, which is the framework, and it has 5 components: control environment, information communication, risk management or risk assessment, monitoring of controls, and then control activities. So each of these components have a set of requirements that together combined are those security requirements. So if we look at the first one, it's called control environment. It doesn't have much with technical controls. It's not really the sort of a security controls. Those controls are about more of a tone from the top, how the control environment is. What is the control environment? How do you vet out employees? How do you ensure that your employees are doing what they're supposed to be doing? How do you keep them accountable for the performing their controls? What is, as I referred earlier, your integrity and ethical values? How does board, or where is the oversight? Who kind of provides that oversight to the company or over the service that is being provided? So these are the different kind of areas. There are 5 criteria, 5 requirements in the control environment: ethical values, oversight of board of directors, how you vet employees, how you keep employees accountable, what is the reporting structure. So again, there are probably 6, 7 controls that companies will have to address those requirements. what level of detail do you want me to go in this area? Should I move on, or I'm just not sure? Because
No, I think I think I want to dig in just a little bit. So
okay.
yeah, keep going.
So, for example, there is a common criteria 1.4, for example, and that's 1 refers to the control environment as the first section. And it talks about retaining employees, vetting out employees, and making sure that employees know what they're doing and they're qualified. Typical controls there, you will see background checks. Is that the only way? No. You could do some countries don't allow background checks. Do you want to do background checks for all employees? Maybe as a control. Or do you want to have scope it down only to employees and contractors who have access to customer data in production? That would exclude certain employees, right? Like, for example, marketing people. They may not be in scope then for that control. What about timing of when those background checks are performed? Is that before the start date? Is it before they get access to production? This could be different dates. So your control may say the company conducts background checks on all new hires. That includes contractors, employees, everybody. And they could say before their start date. Like, okay. Then you start looking and uncovering it. It's like, well, do we really need to have marketing people there? And okay. The company conducts background checks for users who will have access to production and customer data. That's already scoping down who is part of that control. And then you're saying, maybe not before start date, before they get access. So you have this sort of a need to figure out what's important. We could report and we can audit everyone before their start date. That's fine too. Sometimes companies want that, and we will sort of audit that. If you want to scope it down, that is possible too, because that's what actually matters in this example. Who has access to customer data? Who has access to that production, to the where everybody actually live environment, those transactions that happen? That's one control, for example. There is a requirement about how you hold employees accountable for performing their controls. There are various ways to address that. Most common is having performance reviews, where there is evaluation of people doing their job. I sometimes hear that, well, if they don't do their job, we fire them. It's like, I don't know if I know how to audit that. I guess it's a valid point, but what about those that you don't fire who are on the PIP or on the performance improvement plan or something like that? But it has very little actually to do with technical or with what CTOs would do. It's more of the HR controls. And then there are some requirements there about that there is board oversight. CTO may be sitting on the board, maybe presenting to the board, but there should be some control that provides more of the relatively independent oversight of all the operations. It doesn't have to be the board, even though the requirement talks about the board. If you dig in and look into the definition of terms, actually it shows that it doesn't have to be just the board. It could be a committee. There could be a steering committee. Or, for example, I have some clients where we are auditing a subsidiary of a very large corporation. That subsidiary has very little to do or very little visibility to the board of this multinational company. So they have an executive or they have a information security steering committee that provides oversight. It's not the board. It doesn't have necessarily to be the board. But these are the controls that you have in that control environment section.
And so I wonder. So that's fantastic. And I think I saw one of my CTOs. I saw them before and after a SOC 2, and when they they literally have badges, they have sign-in sheets, they have. So that's the kind of access control as well, right?
Yes, there is a category of controls called logical and physical access. It depends whether, let's say, if you are a cloud company, there is very little, well, there is no customer data on site in the physical office. If you're a cloud company and you build your software on top of Amazon infrastructure or on top of Google infrastructure, you could be anywhere else in the world and still manage your platform. You could be in South Africa or in Russia or in Germany. You could be at Starbucks sitting in the past, sitting there. Do you need to have physical access controls? How are you going to control all the Starbucks, right? Sort of, it's impossible. You need to sort of make logical sense. Where is the customer data? Do you need to have physical controls around your office? It kind of depends on service that you provide. If there are, I don't know, on-site customer files, like let's say you have records of disability, like you have physical disability records, and you have the room on your premises, and that's where you hold this data. Then yes, you should have physical access controls. Or if you have on-site data center and your server room is on site, yeah, you should have controls around your data center. Who can access that?
Now, does this security criteria also include application and infrastructure security?
Mm-hmm.
So
it has all the layers. It's data, network, application, network.
vulnerability scanning and all of that.
Correct. There is a section of the requirements called systems operations, and that refers more or less to your incident response process, from kind of what are different, the requirement about how you detect vulnerabilities, whether let's say the requirement 7.1 states that how do you monitor for configuration changes that may be indicative of vulnerability. The next one says, what about anomalies? Are you monitoring for anomalies? And could they be incident, or could they be some breaches, or could they be indicative of vulnerabilities? And then how do you triage that? And then what's your incident response plan? What if it is a security incident? And how do you recover from that? Do you do root cause analysis? Do you do some sort of a whatever, after action reviews, RCAs, whatever the terminology is being used? So you do look at that sort of a vulnerability scanning, pen test. It doesn't state that you have to do pen test.
Now, those are controls, right?
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly, but it's usually being asked, why is it that, and often your customers, your prospects will ask, show me the results of your pen test. So if you're already doing that, yeah, let's just put it in as a control that you have, and it's easy for you to address since you're already doing that anyway, and your customer is required to do that.
Got it.
Then there is a section about change management, and it does talk about
inside of security.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
There is a requirement for change management, and it is just one, very sort of a generically stated. It's about how do you manage, what's your change management process around data application infrastructure. Depends on what type of shop you are. Let's say if you're CI/CD pipeline, what are the controls? How do you make sure that whatever data hits whatever code hits production is actually going to be good code, not going to break something, that's not going to introduce vulnerabilities? Are you doing, let's say, your container scanning if you are running Docker containers, for example, if you infrastructure that? Do you do static code analysis or dynamic code analysis? These are all controls that companies may have. Do you have open source dependency scans? Like, I don't know, do you do if you're in GitHub, or in your code repos, do you have peer review that your pull requests need to be reviewed by somebody other than who developed code? So all those controls, usually change management has, 5, 6 controls or something like that. What is your sort of a change management policy? What is your SDLC? The whole idea of SOC 2 is, what are your commitments to customers? How do they translate into policies? And what is it that you do, sort of the procedure? What are the controls? It should be all aligned. If you are promising your customers that you are going to run a pen test every year, or that you're not going to use their data in production or in testing, in non-production, then your policy should be like that. And in practice, you should be doing that. So going back to your initial question, you have control environment, which are like more HR board type of controls. You have section that talks about information and communication. How do you communicate internally that your folks need to know what they do? Like, do you have security awareness training? Although that's not a requirement, most companies have that because it helps to disseminate the information. Do you have some sort of SOPs or playbooks of people know how to perform their duties? What happens if, for example, one of your key engineers leaves and all the legacy knowledge goes with him? Do you still know how to run the shop, right? Or your DevOps person leaves, can you still maintain your platform? There is an area called risk assessment, and there are a couple control requirements in the risk assessment section. There you sort of think about it. How is it that you prioritize what areas you need to focus on? You perform risk assessment, and it could be according to whatever methodology you choose. You look at your risks. Most common companies look at, here is a risk that has been identified, and you look at probability and impact. And as the factor of those two, you determine the risk, and then you decide how you're going to mitigate that risk. Either you reduce it, or maybe you accept it, or you transfer risk.
Sorry, go ahead.
You put controls in place to reduce likelihood or impact so that the risk is no longer that high. And we as auditors, we will ask you, so if you are telling me that you are doing annual risk assessment, that is one of the, that's actually a requirement. It's in the actual requirement that says that company performs periodic risk assessments. Then I will say, okay, show me how you perform risk assessment. Show me what you are, how you are mitigating the risks.
Oh, that's that. Two questions. Does having insurance policies play into that, or is that another control? So if you have a cyber insurance policy or against ransomware, for instance, or something,
it's there is no specific requirement to have a cybersecurity. There is in the illustrative controls, in those points of focus that explain those requirements, there is one that talks about cybersecurity, but it is more about how does business recover from, it's more about like BCP and DR type of thing. What do you have? If you have cybersecurity, yes, you could have it called out as a control, usually addressing one of the requirements. But the requirement is much more generic than require you to have the cybersecurity.
Yeah, I understand. Okay, well, let's move just on that point, and maybe we'll get to that with privacy. But is GDPR anything to do with this?
The GDPR, if you are GDPR compliant, if you have controls to address GDPR, most likely you will be able to meet the requirements of SOC 2 privacy category.
Okay.
They're more generic, but the concepts are the same, sort of a choice and consent, opt-in, opt-out, third-party management, and sort of you could have your DPAs or data privacy addendums,
Okay.
right? So the way if you are GDPR compliant or CCPA compliant in California, then you're probably going to be able to meet, most likely, because the requirements in SOC are less specific.
Got it. So let's go to availability.
Mm-hmm. Availability has 3 requirements, and usually, as I said, it's add-on. Typically, if you do security and if you are a cloud company, it's relatively easy to address availability category. The 3 requirements in availability are capacity management. So, as I said, if you're a SaaS company, it's relatively easy because most likely you are over-provisioned anyway. You can have your auto-scaling, you can have your different availability zones within the same region. So there is, and you monitor probably for availability anyway. So the CPU utilization, all that. Some companies that are not SaaS, you need to sort of a plan for capacity and how you work with sales, or what is it that how you monitor and know when to increase capacity. And the second 2 requirements, the other 2 requirements, the second is that you do backups, and the third one is about recovery. So your DR plans or BCP-DR, how do you test your recovery, or do you test your backups for recovery? So
Yeah.
these are relatively easy for most companies already have that.
Yeah, and I think even listening to you talk about the security criteria, these are just all good things to think
Yep.
about and have. It's not doesn't feel redundant at all. It actually feels like a bit of a North Star.
It is very sort of a, let's call it base. I don't think that SOC framework is necessarily the most stringent. It's a very much more of a baseline that companies should have anyway. There are maybe few things that may seem sort of a kind of a like,
Yeah,
why are we doing that?
Yeah.
And especially if they are in the kind of a more generic in the control environment area. For most companies, logical access, change management, availability, that's what companies already do. You just, as an auditor, we just need to kind of make sure that evidence is retained, that it's kind of you just need to tweak maybe a little bit to make sure that what you have is, let's call it auditable, right? Because you may have something you kind of, if you are a startup back in the office days, you will yell over the wall saying, "Can I grant access?" and asking your CTO. And it's like, sure. And that's not going to fly in the audit. We cannot really, unless you actually had a voice recording of that. But we need to have some sort of evidence that something was approved, if that's what the way it is supposed to be.
Got it. So availability is overall capacity with uptime, what we are familiar with in terms of load balancing / redundant data centers.
Yep.
Second one is backups, and the third one is recovery. So
Yep.
let's move to confidentiality.
Yep. So confidentiality only has 2 requirements. One is about identifying and maintaining confidential data. And that is quite a lot of controls in the security section that are related to that, about maintaining data. More, the kind of additional control you may want to have is, do you know all the data stores where your data, confidential data is? Some companies have trouble with that. And what is considered confidential data? is raw data that your company uploads. Let's say if your company uploads some sort of a files, or your customer your end user uploads some sort of a files. Is that confidential data? You process it later, maybe you have some model. So what is confidential data is a question. Are the logs confidential data, metadata? Is it confidential, not confidential? So first figure out what is confidential data and then identify and make sure that your customers agree with that, right? If your customers think that this set of data is confidential and you don't think so, there is obviously a disconnect, right? What do your what do your contracts say, or terms of service, or whatever the contractual obligations that you establish with your customers? What do they say about confidential data? I had one client where they have a sort of a legal things that this is confidential. That's what confidential data. Their CTO thinks that no, in the founder, that that's something different. And then the MSA says something third. So you just need to make sure that everybody is in alignment about what is confidential data. And then where is it stored? That's the first requirement. And then this second is about data retention and data purging.
Okay.
Once you identify your data, confidential data, what do you promise your customers about retaining data and purging data, and what do you do it actually in practice? So, for example, you may have requirements to retain data for 7 years after the termination of the contract. But do you remember that 7 years passed after they were terminated? Do you actually purge that data? A lot of startups, lots of companies want to keep the data indefinitely. The question is that good practice? Maybe even if your contracts say that you have the right to retain the data forever. What if you do, unfortunately, get breached? I don't know, 5 years after you terminated contract with some customer. You're still going to be on the hook because you hold that data for them. Do you want to keep that data? Is it still valid data, or is it old data? Does it still give you sort of a insights that you are looking for if you are so what is the data, and how do you dispose of the data, and what you promise customers, what your policy says, and how you do it in practice?
So let's say I am processing customer data, which is considered confidential.
Mm-hmm.
Let's say I'm a fintech company and I upload customer transactions to a BI tool,
Mm-hmm.
or to some third-party Snowflake database service, or how is it like a chain of responsibility where I now have to obtain their SOC 2 report to give it as part of my SOC 2 reports, or how does that work? Third parties.
So there is you are responsible for yourself. Obviously, you cannot control what a third party or your vendor does, but you are responsible for vendor management at your company and monitoring your vendors. And there is a requirement in the security section of SOC 2 is what are your business partners and vendors and third parties, and business partners, what are your controls? And there you would typically look at what is your vendor management process and sort of a life cycle of a vendor, right? How do you bring in a vendor and integrate into your service, into your product? Will they have access to data, to your customers' data? Will you transfer any data? How do you vet them out? And then how you typically annually monitor them? You may review their SOC reports. You may ask whatever processes you put in place, depending on the risk. Obviously, if you have a janitorial service, maybe you don't need to vet them too much. Or if you do have some data on premises, then maybe you do need to have. So you do your risk evaluation of a vendor and determine, okay, this is what we should be doing with this type of vendor and how we monitor and evaluate them before we assess them, before we onboard them, or you don't need to do that. Right? So it's kind of it's up to your company policies, your company risk appetite, but it's sort of you need to kind of think through that. But there is a section about vendor management, but you could only be responsible for the controls that you could responsible for, basically.
Okay.
Right?
That makes sense.
I mean, AWS is a vendor, right? You build on top of AWS. How much control do you have about their controls? Zero. But you could at least monitor. It's like, well, they're saying they're promising this. Maybe I need to put something else to augment what they have because it's not enough.
Okay. So what I'm hearing you say is that you're responsible for your own management. There is a vendor management section that tests the integrity of your relationships, of how you pick, what you do, blah, blah, blah.
Mm-hmm.
But my own audit process does not get held up because I can't get information from a vendor or from a third party on what they do, how do they store my data. For instance, do they encrypt, when they ingest my data, do they encrypt it at rest?
Yep. So what you do is, before you bring that vendor on board, you may want to say, okay, how do I know? You just decide, is it important for you that they encrypt data at rest? That's kind of your risk assessment of a vendor or the service that you are trying to purchase from a vendor. And can they show it? If it's important to you, then maybe you need to sort of hold them up and say, okay, show me that you are doing that. But if it is not important, then you decide that, okay, that's fine, that you don't encrypt. You don't even ask them that question if you don't care if they encrypt or not encrypt data. You decide what's important to you. And if you decide that it is important, then yeah, we will, like, if you say, okay, all tier one, let's say, or risk one vendors need to have SOC reports and this and whatever your requirements are. And once you determine that a new vendor is a risk one, then we'll say, okay, if you're thinking that this is what they should be doing, show me that you've done that.
Okay. Makes total sense. So then let's move on to process integrity.
Yep, processing integrity. I could tell you that very, very few companies do processing integrity unless they do like all 5 categories. But it's very uncommon area. And it's more or less about data inputs, what's happening in the black box in the middle, and how the outputs are handled. Are you distributing reports to the right people? Is there sort of the data, while you being processing it, is modified or processed according to what it's supposed to do? So there are controls over inputs of data, controls over modification of data if there is some sort of a massaging of the data, and then controls over output of the data.
But I think you've just described all web applications on the planet.
Yes. So that's why most companies don't really sort of I could tell you I've had probably less than 10% of my clients go through processing integrity controls.
Okay.
I have some that is providing the it's like automated reallocation of your investments based on your risk tolerance. And so there is some rules or some sort of a algorithm that runs, and we're looking at that algorithm doesn't screw up the reallocation.
Okay. So if someone enters a first name and a last name and I fix the capitalization before I store it in the database.
No, I don't think you want to go through the process.
If I format phone numbers.
No, I don't think you need to go. I mean, from my perspective, the more you increase the number of categories of controls as criteria, the more expensive the audit is.
Got
So
it.
if you don't really need, because we as auditors have to do more, obviously, you have to do more, and that increases the scope, and it's more expensive. Don't know if you don't have to do it, maybe you don't do it.
Got it. Okay, so let's do the last one for around privacy.
And privacy is, I believe there are 18 requirements. There is a chunk of those requirements that are addressed by the security categories and confidentiality, but then there are all those opt-in, opt-out. There is a section about third parties. There is a choice of consent. You need to have your privacy policy that describes all the details that the company handles around the PII. And I just want to make sure that sort of people, I always try to explain that confidentiality is much broader than just privacy. You may process company sales data. That does not necessarily mean that you have private personal information, right? That you have PII. But yet PII will be confidential most likely. So it's more of a sensitive data. In the privacy world, sensitive is more related to to personal data. But that's more of a terminology. So you need to have your privacy statement. I don't know if your privacy statement, which is externally facing, is the same as privacy policy internally. Often it is one and the same. Companies publish privacy policy and use that terminology for the external facing document. You need to have, if you have a GDPR, you may already have a DPO, so you will have your contact information, who handles any privacy issues. Some companies use OneTrust to respond to or some other tools to respond to the privacy inquiries. You need to have controls around how you kind of make sure that the data, PII data, is updated and it's check if it's high quality or that it's actually correct data. So there are, as I mentioned, common sense controls. It's not really anything specific to in the SOC. It's not anything specific to any legislature. It's not catering to GDPR or to HIPAA.
Okay.
It is rather generally accepted privacy principle.
Okay.
Right, or standards.
Okay. That is a mouthful.
Yes. And, but I just wanted to reiterate, it's not rocket science. Once you sort of spend a little bit of time listening to your recordings or kind of asking questions, you could figure it out. It's not that difficult, and it's not that scary.
Yes, and I think that's why I enjoy my conversation with you so much, because, and kind of why I wanted to go into some of those requirements just to demystify what this is. And I will say, coming into these conversations, SOC 2 sounds like just this heavy, horrible thing that rests on you that you have to do. And I'm sure you can view it that way, but you can also view it as a guiding, like the train tracks, just to show you, where your company in this day and age needs to be with these 5 different criteria. So I actually think that this could be a great tool just for any CTO and or the whole company, just to make sure that they are living out best practice in 2021.
Yep. And you could sort of see sometimes I come and we do the audit and it takes forever. It just takes forever. Months and months later, and we're still auditing just because the company sort of looks at it very kind of maybe type of thing. Not, and then there are some companies that are so on top of it. And it's actually like really quickly. They're like, yep, here it's the high priority for us, this audit. Everybody is on board. And we're done, more or less. And it's really quick, and they answer the questions. I mean, I have some that takes, I don't know, we should be starting the next year audit. We're still finishing the first year audit. That's kind of how long it takes. Months, like 6 months, 7 months. Is it enjoyable? No. Do we still do it? And I keep telling them sometimes, like, you know what? I'm not going to go away. You'd better give in and just start giving me information I'm asking you to. Because we will still finish this audit. We need to finish. You need to finish. And their customers are asking for the report. And it's like, well, I cannot. I have some clients that we provide them. We will finish audit, create a draft report, and send it to a client to review, because we wanted to make sure that what we publish, everybody agrees with, or not publish, but issue. And I have some clients that look at this report for months, like literally like 3 months later. It's like, do you have any comments about the draft report? No, like we'll send you the draft, we'll send you our comments, and then you'll get back. It's like, no comments. It's like, took 3 months and you don't have any comments. Fine, we will issue them within like 2 days after that, but for 3 months we'll be sitting and waiting for that draft report back. So there are different approaches, but I mean, I'm fine with that. It's just sort of everybody has their own priorities. I understand audit is not necessarily the highest priority for a lot of companies, but it does help to mature, I guess, if you are a
Absolutely.
startup.
And I think this is, to me, where I see the opportunity for the CTO, especially of a scaling company, to facilitate these conversations. And really,
It also sort of for a more established company, if they don't have a SOC report yet, it helps to bring, and they haven't had an audit, it may help to bring some outside people to look at it
I
and to
agree.
see, are you sort of, you may think that that's what you are doing, but you're not. That's not what boots on the ground are doing. Not always.
Yeah, and I think that so for me, an ideal scenario is the CTO takes responsibility for making it happen, but absolutely brings in service providers, auditors, consultants to help and be that outside perspective to get it done. And man, like you said, manage the project.
Yeah. Yeah.
So Nelly, this was wonderful.
Well, I'm glad I demystified, hopefully I demystified SOC 2. And yeah, if you have any,
You did this all without taking one sip of water.
I have the whole bottle of Pellegrino standing next to me, just in case I choke up. If you do have any questions, happy to, or your CTOs, I'm always happy to chat and sort of explain what I may have not explained well today.
I
Feel
love
free
it.
to
I
feel
love
free
it.
to reach out. No obligations. I believe in the pay it forward, and the more secure we are, the better we are as a sort of a overall.
I love
All
it.
companies,
Yes.
the easier it is for everybody.
I was hoping you were going to say you believe in 7 CTOs.
I haven't been to your meetings yet.
You're in San Francisco, right?
I am.
Okay, well, we'll have to meet you because I feel like you're one of us.
Thank you. I think that some of folks I know are part of your group,
Possibly.
but again, I'm not a CTO, so I've
I
never
feel
been
like you could have
invited.
been.
I feel left out now.